Clara Bennett pressed her dead father's pocket watch against her chest and walked through the door of the most powerful man in Montana without knocking. She didn't wait to be invited. She didn't lower her eyes. She looked Nathan Cole straight in the face and said, "You don't need a cook. You need someone to remind you what living looks like, because whatever you've been doing in this house, it isn't that." He didn't fire her. He didn't speak. He just stepped aside. And nothing in either of their lives was ever the same again. Before we go any further, if you're watching this right now, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button below. Leave a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Every single comment means the world to this channel, and I promise you, you do not want to miss what happens next. The fire in Nathan Cole's study had been dead since Tuesday. Not because he didn't have wood. He had more cords of split pine stacked against the east wall of the barn than a man could burn through in 3 winters. Not because he didn't have matches. He had a whole tin of them sitting on the mantelpiece right beside the framed photograph of his mother that he hadn't looked at directly in going on 4 years. The fire was dead because Nathan Cole had stopped noticing when things went cold. That was the truth. Nobody in Broken Spur, Montana said out loud, though everybody knew it. They said other things instead. They said Nathan Cole was serious. They said he was disciplined. They said he was the kind of man who built an empire out of raw ground and sheer will and didn't have time for sentiment. Thomas Reed, his ranch foreman, had been saying those things on Nathan's behalf for going on 11 years, and he'd gotten very good at it. But Thomas was 62 years old and had known Nathan since the boy was barely tall enough to sit a horse, and he knew the difference between a man who was serious and a man who was disappearing. Nathan was disappearing. It happened slowly, the way most things that matter happen slowly, until one day you look up and the thing you thought was just a season turns out to have been your whole life. Nathan had been 27 when his father died and left him the Cole Ranch outright. 4,000 acres of the best grazing land in the territory. A herd that numbered in the hundreds, and a house big enough to swallow 3 families whole. He'd taken all of it and built it into something his father never could have imagined. 6,000 acres now. 2 full-time hands for every 100 head. A reputation that made bankers in Helena sit up straight when they heard his name. But somewhere in the building, Nathan had stopped building anything that mattered. He ate his meals, standing at the kitchen counter, and only when his stomach forced him to stop working. He slept 4 hours, some nights 6 on a good one, and woke before the sun, because the silence of the house after dark had a quality to it that he didn't trust. He hadn't hosted a dinner in 3 years. He hadn't sat on the front porch to watch a sunset in longer than that. The housekeeper he'd kept for a decade, a widow named Mrs. Folks, who made excellent biscuits and never asked him unnecessary questions, had left in February to go live near her daughter in Bozeman, and Nathan had not replaced her. He told Thomas it wasn't necessary. Thomas had looked at him the way a man looks at someone who is saying something so obviously wrong that arguing feels almost cruel, and then Thomas had said, "Yes, sir," and walked away, and neither of them had mentioned it since. Then the letter came from St. Louis, Margaret Whitfield. The engagement had been arranged 18 months prior through a correspondence initiated by Margaret's father, a railroad investor named Archibald Whitfield, who'd done business with Nathan's father 30 years ago and thought their children might suit one another. Nathan had agreed to it the way he agreed to most things that seemed reasonable and required nothing of him emotionally, quickly, practically, without much examination of what it would actually mean when the day arrived. The day was arriving. Margaret's letter was polite and well composed. She wrote that she was looking forward to seeing Montana territory. She wrote that she hoped to be useful to him. She asked in a tone that managed to be both gentle and precise whether there would be adequate domestic arrangements in place, as she had grown up in a household that valued order and comfort, and she did not wish to arrive to chaos. Nathan read that letter 3 times, standing at his desk. Then he walked through the house. He walked through it the way you walk through a place when you're trying to see it for the first time, or maybe the last time, trying to see it the way someone else would see it. He walked through the front hall with its bare wooden floors and the elk head mounted above the door that he'd never particularly liked, but had never bothered to take down. He walked through the sitting room where the curtains had been closed for so long that when he tried to pull one open, the rod came away from the wall in his hand. He walked through the dining room with its long table built for 12 people, and its 8 empty chairs, and its surface so thick with dust that he could have written his name in it. He stood in the kitchen for a long time. The kitchen was the worst of it. There was a cast-iron stove that hadn't been properly seasoned in God only knew how long. There were shelves that held the bare minimum salt, some coffee, a tin of hardtack crackers he'd been eating for breakfast because they required nothing from him. The window above the sink looked out over the kitchen garden, which had gone entirely to scrub and weed and dry brown grass. Nathan was not a man who embarrassed easily, but standing in that kitchen, he felt something that was close enough to shame that the difference barely mattered. He'd spent 11 years building one of the finest cattle operations in the Montana Territory, and he had let the inside of his own home become something he wouldn't have wished on a stranger. He went and found Thomas in the equipment barn. "I need help," Nathan said. Which was not a thing Nathan Cole said without it costing him something. Thomas didn't look up from the harness he was oiling. "Help with what?" "The house. Margaret Whitfield arrives in 12 days. I need the house to be—" He stopped. He wasn't certain what word to use. Livable seemed insufficient. Presentable seemed dishonest. What he meant was something he didn't quite have language for. He wanted the house to feel like somewhere a person would want to be. He wasn't sure he knew what that required. "You need a housekeeper," Thomas said. "Been needing one since February." "Yes? Should have hired one in March." "I know that." Thomas set down the harness and looked at Nathan directly, which he only did when he had something worth saying. "There's a notice board at Elspeth Morton's dry goods store. People post work available, work wanted. Might find someone there." Nathan rode into Broken Spur the next morning. Broken Spur was the kind of town that had started as a necessity and grown into a habit. It had a saloon, a livery, Elspeth Morton's store, a church that doubled as a schoolroom on weekdays, a doctor who was also the barber, and about 400 souls who all knew one another's business, whether they wanted to or not. Nathan Cole rode in rarely enough that when he did, people took notice. He was not a man who invited conversation, and the town had learned over the years to respect that. He tied his horse at the rail outside Elspeth's store and went inside. The notice board was just inside the door beside a barrel of dried beans and a display of cotton thread. It held the usual assortment: a man looking to sell a plow, 2 notices about missing livestock, an advertisement for a traveling medicine show that had come through 6 weeks ago and probably wasn't coming back, and 1 square of paper written in a clear, even hand that did not waste a single word: experienced cook and housekeeper. Honest work only. Inquire for Clara Bennett at the Silver Creek boarding house. Nathan read it twice. Honest work only. That phrase caught at something in him. Most notices like this said willing worker or reliable service or some other phrase that told you nothing. This one had a particular quality to it. Like the person who wrote it had encountered enough dishonest work that they'd decided to put it plainly from the start. He wrote down the address. The Silver Creek boarding house was on the far end of Broken Spur's Main Street, past the livery, and around a corner that most of the town's more respectable establishments hadn't gotten around to reaching yet. It was clean enough on the outside with a painted sign and a swept porch, but it had the look of a place where people stayed when they were between other places. Temporary. Uncertain. Nathan knocked. The woman who answered the door was not what he'd expected, though he couldn't have said precisely what he had expected. Clara Bennett was 29 years old, though she carried herself with a steadiness that made age seem beside the point. She was not small. She had the kind of build that comes from years of actual physical labor, not slight, not soft, but capable in a way you could see without being told. Her hair was dark and pulled back practically, and her eyes were the particular dark brown that looks almost black in certain lights and sees more than it lets on. She was wearing a plain gray work dress that had been mended twice at the left sleeve, and she was holding a mug of coffee, and she did not seem startled to find a man like Nathan Cole on the boarding house porch. She looked at him the way you look at a problem you've seen before and already know the shape of. "Mr. Cole," she said. Not a question. Nathan was briefly wrong-footed. "You know who I am. Biggest cattle ranch in the territory. You don't get anonymous. She stepped back from the doorway just enough to not be impolite. You saw my notice. I did. What is it you need? He appreciated the directness. He was not a man who enjoyed preliminary conversation. My housekeeper left in February. I have a guest arriving in 12 days. The house needs attention. I need someone who can cook, keep the house running, and manage it without requiring a great deal of direction. Clara regarded him with an expression that wasn't unfriendly, but wasn't accommodating either. How long? I'm not certain. At minimum through the guest's arrival, possibly longer depending. What's the pay? He named a figure. It was fair, more than fair actually, and he knew it. He hadn't seen any reason to offer less than fair. Something shifted in Clara's expression. Not warmth exactly, but an acknowledgement. When do you need me? Tomorrow morning would not be too soon. She nodded slowly, looking past him for a moment at the street behind him, as if she was calculating something he wasn't privy to. Then she looked back at him and said, I'll be there at first light. I want to see the kitchen before I agree to anything else. If the kitchen isn't workable, neither am I. The kitchen, Nathan said carefully, needs some work. Then we'll see in the morning. He rode home. I didn't sleep much that night. He told himself it was because he was going over the list of repairs the house needed, which was true. But there was something else too, something he didn't examine too closely. A feeling that something was about to change that he hadn't accounted for. He was right. Clara Bennett arrived at first light. She arrived on a good horse, a bay mare that moved like she'd been well cared for, and she had a single bag tied to the saddle and a look on her face that said she'd made her decision and wasn't second-guessing it. Nathan met her at the door. She walked past him into the house without ceremony, and she walked through it the same way he had walked through it 3 days before. Observant, systematic, not commenting on what she saw, just taking it in. She went all the way through to the kitchen. She stood in it for a long moment, taking stock of the stove, the shelves, the window, the state of everything. Then she turned around and looked at Nathan. This is going to take more than 12 days, she said. I know. The stove needs to be seasoned before I can cook on it properly. The kitchen garden is gone. We can salvage some of it if I start today, but don't expect much. Your flour's got weevils. Your coffee's good. Your salt's fine. Everything else on those shelves is either expired or inadequate. She paused. You've been eating hardtack crackers for breakfast. It wasn't a question. Yes, Nathan said. Clara looked at him for a moment with an expression he couldn't read. Not pity, not judgment. Something more complicated than either. Go do your ranch work, Mr. Cole. I'll get started. What do you need from me? Money for supplies from Morton's. I'll write you a list. And someone to chop wood. The wood box is empty, and if you want hot food tonight, I need a fire. I can chop the wood myself. She blinked. Just slightly. Like that surprised her. All right, she said. Then get to it. He chopped the wood. It was a strange morning. Nathan Cole was not accustomed to being directed in his own home, but he found that Clara's manner of directing didn't grate the way he'd expected. She didn't give orders so much as she stated facts and left him to draw the obvious conclusions. The wood box needs filling. The implication, fill it. The stove needs seasoning. The implication, she would handle it, but she needed him out of the kitchen. By mid-morning, he could smell something from the direction of the house that he hadn't smelled in longer than he could clearly remember. Actual cooking, not hardtack crackers, not coffee heated over a barely alive fire. Something with onions and herbs and meat that had been properly browned, and the smell of it reached him out in the equipment yard, where he was working with Thomas on a busted wagon wheel, and Thomas looked up and sniffed and said without looking at Nathan, "Whoever you hired, don't let her leave." Nathan said nothing, but he thought about it. The midday meal was a beef and potato stew that made Nathan aware in a way he hadn't been in years that he had been starving himself in some way that went beyond food. He sat at the kitchen table, not the dining room table. The kitchen table which Clara had cleared and scrubbed and set with 2 plates without asking whether that was where he wanted to eat, and he ate the whole bowl, and then for the first time in memory looked around for more. Clara was eating standing at the counter, which she seemed to prefer. "Sit down," Nathan said. "If you're working here, you eat at the table." She looked at him for a moment. "You sure about that?" "I just said it." She brought her bowl to the table and sat across from him, and they ate without talking, which should have been awkward and somehow wasn't. Thomas came in for lunch with two of the younger hands, Bill Crane, who was 24 and had been working the ranch for 2 years, and a newer hire named Pete Dawson, who was 17 and still figuring out how to be in the world. Clara served them all without being asked, and she remembered after the first exchange of 20 words that Pete Dawson took his coffee with no sugar, and that Bill Crane's right hand had been bothering him since a fence post incident 2 weeks ago. "Let me see that," she said to Bill, nodding at his hand. Bill looked at Nathan. Nathan had no opinion. Bill held out his hand. Clara looked at it with a practiced eye. "You've been favoring it. The palm's swollen still. You want me to wrap it properly tonight? I've got linen and I know how." Bill looked surprised and a little embarrassed in the way young men get when they're being taken care of by someone who actually knows what they're doing. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "That'd be yes, ma'am. Thank you." Thomas was watching all of this. Nathan knew Thomas was watching it because Thomas had spent 11 years watching Nathan, and Nathan had spent 11 years noticing everything Thomas noticed. Later, when the hands had gone back to work, and Clara had moved to the far end of the kitchen to begin sorting through the situation with the kitchen garden through the window, Thomas paused at Nathan's elbow and said very quietly, "You ought to think about keeping her on past the 12 days. "I know," Nathan said. "Margaret Whitfield's going to arrive, and this house is going to be a different place than it was last week." "Yes. That's going to matter." Nathan looked at Thomas. "I know that too." Thomas left. Nathan sat at the kitchen table for another moment, listening to Clara moving around the kitchen, hearing the small sounds of someone working purposefully in a space and making it their own. And he recognized for the first time what had been missing from this house. Not furniture, not cleanliness, not a woman's touch, which was the kind of thing people said and didn't actually mean anything. What had been missing was the sound of someone who intended to stay. Not visiting, not passing through. Someone who had decided that this place was worth the effort. Clara had been there 8 hours. He didn't know yet what she'd decided. But the kitchen was warm, and the wood box was full. And for the first time in 3 years, Nathan Cole ate a hot dinner at a table that had been set for him, and it tasted like something he hadn't had words for until right now. It tasted like the beginning of something. The days that followed had a rhythm to them that Nathan hadn't experienced in so long that it took him several of them before he recognized it as rhythm at all. He woke before dawn as he always did. But now there was light in the kitchen window when he came downstairs. Now there was coffee already made. Now there was, depending on the morning, biscuits or cornbread or eggs from the 3 hens Clara had discovered, locked in a half-forgotten corner of the equipment shed, and relocated to a proper coop she'd built herself out of spare lumber with Pete Dawson's help on the 3rd day. Nathan hadn't known there were hens. "You didn't know because you weren't paying attention," Clara said, not unkindly when he mentioned this. "A ranch this size, there's a lot you're not paying attention to." He should have taken offense at that. He didn't. "What else am I not paying attention to?" he asked. She gave him a list, not a short one. There was a section of fence on the north pasture that had been partially repaired, but not properly, and would come down in the first hard rain. There was a drainage issue near the barn that had been causing water to pool in a way that was going to rot the foundation timbers if left another season. There was a young horse in the second paddock that had a stone bruise that nobody had caught, because nobody had been looking at the horses as individuals rather than as inventory. "How do you know about the horse?" Nathan asked. "I walked the paddock this morning before you were up." He looked at her. "Why?" She met his gaze steadily. "Because I wanted to know what was there." That was the thing about Clara Bennett that Nathan couldn't stop noticing. She was curious in a way that wasn't personal or invasive. She wasn't curious about people's private business, but she was relentlessly curious about problems, about what was wrong and why and what it would take to fix it. She noticed things. She filed them. She acted on them without being told to. It was Nathan realized exactly what he did with the ranch. He'd just never seen anyone else do it before, not in a house. The kitchen garden came back faster than he'd expected. Clara salvaged the kale and the late-season carrots and started new beds with seedlings she'd gotten from a woman in town, a Cherokee woman named Hannah Bird, who grew herbs and medicinal plants and apparently knew Clara well enough that she'd given her the seedlings on account of past debts and future goodwill. By the end of the first week, there were things growing again outside the kitchen window, green and deliberate, and the sight of them did something to Nathan's chest that he couldn't entirely account for. I was out by the garden fence one evening when Clara came out to check on the seedlings. The sun was going down over the mountains to the west, and the light had that particular quality that Montana evenings could get, that gold and rose and violet all layered together that made even plain things look significant. Clara knelt in the dirt without ceremony and checked the soil with her fingers, the way a person does when they've been gardening long enough that they can read the earth by touch. Nathan said without planning to, "You've done this before, not just the cooking, the whole thing, managing a property." She didn't look up immediately. When she did, her expression was careful. Not closed, but careful. "My father had land," she said. "In Nebraska. It wasn't anything like this, but it was ours." Had, she confirmed, and the word landed quietly like a stone dropped into still water, with all its implications spreading out in circles that she didn't trace for him. I didn't press her. He wasn't sure why. Nathan Cole was a man who valued information and generally pursued it when he wanted it. But something about the way Clara had said that single word made him understand, without being told that she would tell him what mattered when she decided it mattered. He could wait. "You learned the paperwork too," he said. "Land records, legal filings." She looked at him more sharply then. "Why do you say that? The way you organized the household accounts." I looked at the ledger. "The categories you created, they're not a housekeeper's categories." A long pause. "My father couldn't read," she said finally. "I learned everything I could as fast as I could because if I didn't, there was no one else." She went back to checking the soil. "Made me useful, eventually." Nathan stood there another moment watching the light change over the mountains. "You're more than useful," he said. She didn't respond to that, but she didn't dismiss it either. And when she stood up and brushed the dirt from her knees and turned back toward the house, there was something in her face that hadn't quite been there before. Something small and carefully held like a match cupped against a wind. On the 8th day, Silas Grant came to call. Nathan was in his study when Thomas knocked and said there was a visitor. Silas Grant was 50 years old and had the look of a man who had been handsome once and had decided that the memory of it was enough to carry him through. He was a land broker and investor who had come to the Montana Territory 6 years ago and had in those 6 years acquired several properties through means that were technically legal and practically questionable. He dressed well. He smiled often. He said nothing directly when something indirect was available. Nathan had done business with him once 3 years ago. A straightforward land transaction that had concluded without incident, and had not done business with him since, because something about the man put a particular quality of alertness in Nathan's gut that he'd learned over the years to take seriously. Silas settled himself in the chair across Nathan's desk without being invited, which was a thing he did, Nathan recalled. Acted as though comfort was his natural state, and everything around him was arranged for his convenience. "Nathan," Silas said with the smile, "you're looking well. I hear you've gotten help in the house. Good. A man like you shouldn't be rattling around alone." "What can I do for you, Silas?" Silas produced a folder from his jacket. "Water rights. I've been approached by a consortium of investors in Helena who are looking at the creek systems in this section of the territory for future development. Agricultural irrigation. The potential is significant." He laid the folder on Nathan's desk. "I'm reaching out to major property owners first, as a courtesy to discuss partnership possibilities before this goes to territory court for formal arbitration." Nathan looked at the folder without touching it. "Silver Creek runs through the northern section of my land." "It does, and the tributaries, which is of course why you're among the first people I'm talking to." The smile held. "The documentation would simply formalize certain use agreements. Nothing you'd notice in daily operation. The consortium would manage the larger infrastructure." Nathan picked up the folder. He looked at the first page. then the second. The language was dense in the particular way that legal language gets when it's working hard to say something complicated by appearing to say something simple. Nathan was not a lawyer, but he was not unintelligent, and he had read enough contracts in his years of business to know that what he was reading was trying to make him agree to something that wasn't visible on the surface. "I'll need time to review this," he said. "Of course, no rush at all." Silas stood buttoning his jacket. "I'll check back in a few days. I think you'll find it's a straightforward arrangement." Nathan saw him out. He stood in the front hall after the door closed, holding the folder. He didn't know why he walked to the kitchen, but he walked to the kitchen. Clara was at the counter working on the week's bread. She had flour on her forearms, and she was kneading with the particular focused energy she brought to everything, and she looked up when Nathan came in. He set the folder on the table without speaking. She looked at it, then at him. Problem. Possibly. He sat down. Silas Grant was just here. He's representing investors who want to formalize water rights agreements on the creek systems in this section of the territory. He wants me to sign documentation. Clara wiped her hands on her apron and came to the table. She picked up the folder. She read the first page. Then she read the second. Then she set it down and looked at Nathan with an expression he hadn't seen from her before. Something that had gone very still and very focused, the way a person looks when something is connecting to something else deep inside them and they're deciding what to do about it. "He's not formalizing existing rights," she said. "He's reassigning them." Nathan looked at her. "Explain." "The language in Section 4, that clause about operational management and beneficial use allocation. That means whoever signs this is agreeing that the consortium determines beneficial use, not you, them." She turned to the second page. "And this paragraph effectively transfers your priority water claim on Silver Creek in years of shortage, which means a dry year, and they have the rights, and you're downstream." Nathan stared at her. "He called it a partnership," Nathan said. "He called it that because the other word is a taking." She set the folder down and put both hands flat on the table, looking at the pages like they were an old enemy. "Someone did this to my father's land in Nebraska. Not water grazing access. Different documents, same structure. My father signed because he trusted the man explaining it to him. And we lost the land inside 2 years." Her voice was perfectly level. "I was 17. My father died 3 years later. He never recovered from it." The kitchen was very quiet. Nathan looked at the folder. "He's coming back in a few days for my answer," Nathan said. "Don't sign anything," Clara said. "Not a single word. And get those documents to a real lawyer, not anyone Grant's ever done business with. I know a man in Helena, William Thayer. He handles territorial land law. Send for him. Today if you can. Don't wait." Nathan looked up at her. She was watching him with that steady, dark-eyed focus, and there was something in her face that she hadn't intended him to see. Not fear exactly, but the particular kind of vigilance that comes from having been through something that leaves a mark. "You recognize the structure immediately," he said. "Yes." "Because you'd seen it before." "Yes." "You didn't just recognize it because of your father's situation. You studied it." She held his gaze. "I studied everything I could get my hands on, Mr. Cole. Because after Nebraska, I wasn't willing to be ignorant of anything that could be used against a person." She straightened. "Send for your lawyer. Don't talk to Grant again until you have legal counsel present." Nathan stood. He sent the letter to William Thayer that afternoon. He also sat in his study for a long time, turning over the folder in his hands, thinking about a 17-year-old girl learning everything she could, because there was no one else to learn it, and about what it costs a person to carry that kind of knowledge through years of work for hire across a territory that didn't particularly make space for women who understood what Grant's documents actually meant. He thought about the mended sleeve on her gray dress, the single bag on the horse, the careful way she'd said had when she talked about her father's land. He thought about what it would mean if she'd walked away from the boarding house that first morning, and he'd found someone else or found no one, and he'd signed Silas Grant's papers in ignorance. He sat with that for a while. Margaret Whitfield's arrival was 4 days away. The house was warmer than it had been in years. The kitchen was alive. The garden was growing. The stove put out heat that reached the front hall for the first time in living memory. Pete Dawson's fence posts were getting done right. Bill Crane's hand was wrapped and healing. Thomas Reed walked through the kitchen every morning on the way to work and looked at whatever Clara was making with the expression of a man remembering what it felt like to be taken care of. And Nathan Cole, for the first time since his mother died, was eating 3 meals a day at a table. He was not a man given to sentiment. He was not a man who examined his feelings with any more care than he examined a broken axle enough to identify the problem and fix it, and no more. But sitting at the kitchen table on the 9th evening eating supper that Clara had left warming for him, because he'd come in from the north pasture late in the quiet of the house, that was no longer quite silent, he recognized something. He didn't want this to be temporary. He wanted, and he was careful turning the thought over, because he was not a man who wanted things carelessly. He wanted Clara Bennett to still be in this kitchen in a year, in 5 years. He wanted to keep learning what she noticed about the ranch that he'd missed. He wanted to keep hearing her say the word that got to the point faster than anyone else's 3 sentences. He wanted to sit across from someone who looked at Silas Grant's papers and knew in her bones what they meant, because she'd paid the price for that knowledge at 17 years old. He wanted her to choose this place because it meant something to her. Not because he'd hired her. That was a problem. Because Margaret Whitfield was arriving in 4 days. And Nathan Cole had made a promise. He didn't know yet what he was going to do about any of it. He finished his supper in the warm, firelit kitchen. Outside the Montana, dark pressed against the windows, and somewhere in the house, he could hear Clara moving, going to check on something he supposed, or fix something, or notice something he hadn't noticed because that was who she was, and the sound of her footsteps in the hallway was the most inhabited thing he'd heard in this house in 4 years. He sat with that, and somewhere in the territory, a lawyer named William Thayer was reading a letter about water rights documents and a man named Silas Grant. And somewhere in St. Louis, a woman named Margaret Whitfield was packing her trunks. And in the kitchen of the Cole Ranch, a fire burned hot, and even the way a fire burns, when someone who knows what they're doing has laid it right. Nathan Cole put his bowl in the basin and went to bed. He did not sleep well, but for the first time in years, it wasn't because of the silence. William Thayer arrived on the 10th day. He came on the morning stage from Helena, a compact man in his mid-50s with wire-rimmed spectacles and the unhurried manner of someone who had spent decades watching people make expensive mistakes and had long since stopped being surprised by it. He carried a leather satchel that looked like it had traveled more miles than most horses, and when Nathan met him at the door, Thayer shook his hand once firmly and said, "Let me see the documents before I say anything else." Nathan brought him to the study. Clara brought them both coffee without being asked, set the cups on the desk, and was halfway back to the door when Thayer looked up from the folder and said, "You read these already." It wasn't aimed at Nathan. Clara stopped, turned. "I looked at them, yes." "What did you make of Section 4, A beat?" Clara came back to the desk. She pointed to the paragraph without touching the page. Beneficial use allocation. The language sounds like cooperation, but it's a transfer of priority determination. In a drought year, the consortium decides what constitutes beneficial use, and whoever signed this loses their senior water claim. Thayer looked at her for a moment over his spectacles. Then he looked at Nathan. "Where did you find her?" "Notice board at Morton's dry goods store. Keep her." Thayer went back to reading. Clara left without comment, but Nathan caught the slight change in her expression as she went. Not pride exactly, but something quieter than pride. The look of a person who had spent a long time being underestimated and was still not entirely sure what to do when they weren't. Thayer spent 2 hours with the documents. He made notes in a small leather journal. He asked Nathan 3 questions, all of them specific, all of them about dates and prior agreements and the exact boundaries of the Northern Water easement that Nathan's father had filed in 1861. Nathan answered 2 of them from memory and got the 3rd from his own files, and when he handed Thayer the 1861 filing, Thayer held it next to Grant's document and went very still. "There it is," Thayer said. "What?" "This paragraph." He indicated a clause on the 3rd page of Grant's documentation. This language supersedes your father's 1861 easement. It doesn't reference, it doesn't acknowledge it, just quietly overrides it. If you'd signed this without catching it, you would have extinguished a water. Right your father established 21 years ago. He closed the folder. Silas Grant is either the sloppiest lawyer in the territory or the most careful one. I'm inclined toward careful. Nathan felt something harden in his chest. What do I do? Nothing. That's the answer for right now. You do nothing. You don't sign, you don't respond. You don't give Grant any indication that you've had this reviewed. When he comes back for your answer, you tell him you're still looking it over and you need more time. And then I go back to Helena and I look into this consortium, these investors, because Grant doesn't put his name on something like this without multiple properties in play. You won't be the only man he's approached. Thayer closed his satchel. If there are others who've already signed, we need to know before we move. And if there are others who haven't signed yet, they need to know what they're looking at. Nathan walked Thayer back to the front of the house. At the door, Thayer paused. That woman in your kitchen, he said. She read those documents and understood them. Yes. How? She lost her family's land in Nebraska when she was 17. A similar structure. She's been studying land law in her own way ever since. Thayer put on his hat. A lot of men in this territory have been swindled by documents they didn't understand. Not many of them turned that education into something. He looked at Nathan steadily. You should know what you have there. Nathan said nothing. But he thought about it for the rest of the day. Silas Grant came back on the 11th day, one day before Margaret's arrival, which Nathan suspected was not accidental. Grant had a quality of timing that was too precise to be anything but calculated. He came in the late afternoon when the ranch was busy with end-of-day work, and Nathan might be expected to be tired, distracted, ready to want the thing settled. Nathan received him in the front hall. Not the study, not a chair, not a cup of coffee. Grant noticed. Nathan, he said with a smile, have you had a chance to look things over? I have, Nathan said. I'm going to need more time. The smile adjusted slightly, almost imperceptibly. Of course, though I should mention the consortium's timeline is more time, Nathan said. However long it takes. A pause. Grant's eyes moved once briefly toward the kitchen, where the smell of supper was coming through clearly. Clara was cooking something with beef and rosemary, and it filled the whole front of the house. Then Grant's gaze came back to Nathan. You've made some changes around here, Grant said. I have. New housekeeper, I hear. The ranch is running well, Nathan said, which was not a response to what Grant had said, and both of them knew it. Grant left. Thomas was waiting at the corner of the house when Nathan stepped onto the porch to watch Grant's horse disappear down the road. He's going to come back with pressure, Thomas said. I know. He's the kind of man who applies pressure through other people. He'll find a lever. He can try, Nathan said. Thomas was quiet for a moment. Miss Bennett know what that visit was about. She knows what the documents are about. She figured it out before Thayer did. Thomas nodded slowly. Then she also knows Grant isn't going to stop. Nathan looked at Thomas. Thomas looked back. She's not just a housekeeper, Thomas said. No. Nathan agreed. She's not. Thomas went back to work. Nathan stood on the porch for another moment, looking at the road where Grant's dust was still settling. He thought about what Thayer had said about levers, about the kind of man who applied pressure through other people. He went inside. Clara was at the stove, and she turned when he came into the kitchen, and she looked at his face and said without preamble, "He came back." "Yes." "What did he do when you told him you needed more time?" "He looked at the kitchen," Nathan said. Clara turned back to the stove. Her shoulders had a quality of stillness that he recognized now, the kind of stillness that comes from keeping a response inside. "He's going to find out who I am," she said. "If he hasn't already. People talk in towns this size." "What will he find?" She was quiet for a moment. "That I'm from Nebraska. That I worked for 6 different households in 4 years. That I know more about land documents than a cook has any business knowing." She paused. "He might put together why." And if he does, she turned around. Her voice was level, but her eyes were doing something more complicated. If he's the same kind of man who took my father's land, he'll use it. He'll say, I've been filling your head with bad advice. He'll say my history makes me unreliable. He'll try to discredit me before I can discredit his documents. Nathan looked at her steadily. That's a detailed prediction. It's not a prediction, she said. It's the pattern. I've seen it before. What do we do about it? We make sure your lawyer moves faster than Grant does. She turned back to the stove. And we make sure there's nothing he can use. Is there? Nathan asked. Anything he can use? A pause. I don't know yet what he already knows, she said, which is a problem. She served dinner. They ate in the kitchen as they had every night, and Pete Dawson was there, and Bill Crane, and the conversation was about the fence repair on the north pasture and the weather report. Thomas had gotten from a passing rider, and it was entirely ordinary, except for the fact that both Nathan and Clara were doing the particular thing that two people do when they're carrying a shared problem, and choosing for the moment not to name it in front of others. After the hands had gone and the kitchen was clean, Clara stood at the counter looking at the window above the sink, dark now, showing nothing but her own reflection and the warm light from the lamp, and she said, My father's name was James Bennett. His land was in Lancaster County, Nebraska. He had 112 acres that he'd homesteaded in 1863. The man who took it was named Ellery Cross, who worked for a land investment company out of Kansas City. She wasn't looking at Nathan. She was looking at the window. The documents he had my father sign transferred grazing rights in a way that triggered a default clause on the original homestead filing. Legal. Completely legal. My father had no way of knowing. Nathan said nothing. I was 17. I'd been doing the household accounts and the correspondence because my father couldn't read like I told you. But I didn't understand the land documents well enough to catch it. A pause. I've understood every land document I've looked at since then. How long ago was that? 12 years. Nathan did the arithmetic. She'd been carrying this for 12 years. Teaching herself systematically for 12 years because of what happened when she hadn't known enough. I'm sorry, he said. She looked at him then. Something in her expression shifted, not softening exactly, but opening very slightly, like a door that has been shut a long time and is being tried for the first time in a while. I don't tell people that story, she said, because they hear it and they feel sorry, and sorry doesn't help me do my job. I'm not going to feel sorry for you, Nathan said. I'm going to use what you know. She held his gaze for a moment. Good, she said. Then Margaret Whitfield arrived. She came on the noon stage the following day, and Nathan drove the wagon into Broken Spur to meet her himself, which was the proper thing to do. And he stood at the stage stop with his hat in his hands and watched a tall, composed woman in a green traveling dress descend the stage steps with the careful efficiency of someone who had been raised to handle inconvenient situations gracefully. Margaret Whitfield was 30 years old. She was handsome in the way that good breeding and careful presentation produce not beautiful by any flashy standard, but with a quality of self-possession that commanded attention without demanding it. She looked at Nathan when she reached the ground, and she extended her hand and she said, Mr. Cole, it's good to finally meet you in person. Miss Whitfield, Nathan said, welcome to Montana. He helped her with her trunk. They drove to the ranch mostly in polite conversation about the journey, the weather, the landscape, the kind of conversation that two strangers who are supposed to become something more than strangers conduct while they're still figuring out what they actually are to one another. Margaret was sharp. Nathan noticed that within the first quarter mile. She asked pointed questions and listened to the answers with genuine attention. And when he mentioned the cattle operation and the winter grazing rotation, she said something that indicated she understood broadly how ranching worked, which surprised him. You know something about cattle, he said. My uncle has a property in Kansas. I spent summers there as a girl. She looked at the mountains ahead of them. I've never seen mountains quite like these. No, Nathan said. You haven't. He hadn't expected to like her. He did a little. That made things more complicated. When they arrived at the ranch, Clara was in the front hall. She had the house in the best order it had been since Nathan's mother was alive. Everything clean, the curtains open. The sitting room actually usable, the smell of fresh bread coming from the kitchen. She had not dressed up or presented herself in any particular way. She was in her work clothes, practical and neat, and she met Margaret's eyes directly when Nathan introduced them. "Miss Bennet has been managing the household for the past 12 days, Nathan said. "She's been invaluable." Margaret looked at Clara with a quality of attention that was not unfriendly, but was entirely alert. "Miss Bennet," she said. "Miss Whitfield," Clara said. "Your room is ready. If there's anything you need to be more comfortable, please tell me." "Thank you," Margaret said. Clara nodded once and went back to the kitchen. Margaret watched her go. "She's not what I expected," Margaret said, not critically, observationally. "No," Nathan agreed. "She rarely is." The next 3 days were the most complicated Nathan Cole had experienced in a long time, and his life had contained a fair number of complicated stretches. He was hosting his intended fiancée, managing a working ranch, waiting to hear back from William Thayer in Helena, and watching Silas Grant's absence with the particular wariness of a man who knows the quiet before a storm. Margaret was a good guest. She was organized, she was considerate, she didn't impose, and she had the kind of adaptability that Nathan suspected came from being a genuinely capable person rather than from training. She helped Clara in the kitchen one morning without being asked, which was not something Nathan had expected, and he came in from the yard to find the two of them working side by side on a batch of preserves. Not talking much, but managing the not talking with a kind of ease that surprised him. He stood in the doorway for a moment watching. Margaret noticed him first. "Your fence crew did good work on the north section this morning," she said. "I rode out to look at it." "You rode out," he said. "I hoped you didn't mind. Thomas said it was all right." She didn't look apologetic. "I wanted to see the property." "What did you think?" "I think it's remarkable land," she said with a directness that had nothing in it but honesty. "I think it's also a great deal to manage for one person." He looked at Clara, who was not looking at him. "Yes," Nathan said. "It is." The letter from Thayer arrived on the 14th day. Thomas brought it in from the road rider, and Nathan read it standing at his desk, and then he read it again. Thayer had found 4 other property owners in the territory who had received documents from Grant's consortium. 2 had already signed. The signed documents Thayer had now confirmed through a contact at the Territorial Land Office contained the same override mechanism as Grant's documents to Nathan, the quiet extinguishing of prior water rights through the beneficial use clause. The 2 men who had signed didn't know yet what they'd agreed to. The mechanism would only activate in a shortage year, which meant Grant was building a position that might not become apparent for another season or 2, by which time the legal remedies would be far more complicated. Thayer had filed a notice of contest with the Territorial Land Office against the consortium's filing. He needed Nathan's sworn statement about the documents Grant had presented. He needed it within 10 days. He also needed if Nathan was willing the testimony of anyone else who had examined the documents and could speak to their structure. Nathan read that last line twice. Then he went to the kitchen. Clara was making bread. She looked up, read his face, and wiped her hands on her apron. "Thayer found 4 other properties," Nathan said. 2 already signed. He's filed a contest. He needs sworn statements. He put the letter on the table. "He needs yours too, if you're willing." Clara looked at the letter. She didn't touch it. For a long moment she was very still, and Nathan could see her working through something, not the mechanics of it. She'd understood the mechanics immediately, but something larger and older and more personal. "If I give that statement," she said, "Grant finds out for certain who I am and what I know. Yes. He'll go after my credibility, my history. He'll say I have a personal grievance and I'm using you to act on it. Thayer knows that. He'll prepare for it." "Thayer doesn't know everything about Nebraska," she said. Nathan waited. "Ellery crossed the man who took my father's land. He has a partner, has had for 20 years. They worked together across different territories, different names on different documents." She looked at Nathan. "I think that partner is Silas Grant." The kitchen was very quiet. "You think Grant was involved in taking your father's land?" Nathan said. I think he's the same structure operating under different names in a different territory. Yes. Her voice had gone very flat and controlled, in the way that voices go when a person is keeping a very strong feeling in a very small space. I've been looking for the connection for 3 years. I haven't been able to prove it. But you believe it. I know it, she said. The documents are identical in structure. Not similar. Identical. The same legal construction, just applied to different assets: water rights here, grazing rights there. She finally picked up Thayer's letter. If Cross and Grant are connected and Thayer can find the link, this isn't just about your water rights. It's a territorial fraud operation that's been running for at least 12 years. Nathan sat down. He sat down heavily, the way a man sits when the scale of something has just expanded past what he was prepared for. You came to Montana, he said slowly, looking for work. But you were also... I was following the pattern, she said. 3 years of following documents, hearing names, building a picture. She met his gaze. I didn't come to your ranch looking for this. I came because I needed work and you posted honestly. But what I found here... She stopped. What? He said. The documents Grant brought you are the cleanest proof I've ever seen, she said. Because you didn't sign them. Everyone else signed. The unsigned version next to a signed version from one of the other properties shows exactly what the mechanism does. She set the letter down. That's what Thayer needs. Can you get a signed version from one of the other properties? If Thayer can get me access to the filed documents at the Territorial Land Office, yes. Nathan looked at her across the kitchen table. He thought about Thomas saying, she's not just a housekeeper. He thought about Thayer saying, you should know what you have there. He thought about a 17-year-old girl learning everything she could find, because there was no one else, and doing it for 12 years, and following a pattern across 3 territories, and ending up in his kitchen on a cold Montana morning, because she needed work. Give the statement, he said. It'll make things harder, she said. For you. Grant will push back harder if he knows I'm involved. Give the statement, Nathan said again. She looked at him. You're sure, she said, not a question, reading him. I'm sure. She picked up the letter. She held it for a moment, and something moved across her face. Not relief exactly, and not gratitude exactly, but something that encompassed both and was older than either, the expression of a person who has been carrying something a very long time and has just for the first time been offered help carrying it. All right, she said. She set the letter down and went back to her bread. Nathan went back to his desk, but neither of them was doing what they appeared to be doing, and they both knew it, and the kitchen held that knowledge between them, like warmth from the stove, something you couldn't see, but could absolutely feel. It was Thomas who told Nathan what Margaret had said. Thomas came to the study that evening, which was unusual. Thomas communicated in the mornings mostly in practical matters. Coming to the study in the evening meant something worth saying. Miss Whitfield talked to me today, Thomas said. Out by the equipment barn. She was asking about the ranch, how it's been running, how it was before. He paused. She asked about Miss Bennett. Nathan set down the pen he'd been holding. What did she ask? She asked how long Miss Bennett had been here, how things had changed since she arrived. Thomas was choosing his words carefully, which meant he'd thought about them in advance. I told her the truth. Told her this place has felt like a home for the first time in years. A pause. She took that well. She took it honestly, Thomas said. That's the best word for it. She said. He stopped, started again. She said a man ought to know the difference between a house he built and a home someone made for him. Nathan said nothing. She's a perceptive woman, Miss Whitfield, Thomas said. Yes, Nathan said. She is. Thomas went to the door, then he stopped. For what it's worth, he said without turning around, there are people you marry because it makes sense, and then there are people who change the room they walk into. He paused. Both of those things matter, just not always the same way. He left. Nathan sat in his study for a long time. He could hear distantly Clara moving through the house. She always did, one last check in the evenings, making sure the fires were banked properly. The kitchen secured the things that needed to be done before morning done. He heard her footsteps in the hall. He heard the soft sound of her pausing outside the study door. She didn't knock. He didn't call out. She moved on. He sat in the quiet and thought about the difference between sense and change, and about a woman who had walked through his door 12 days ago and turned something on in this house that he hadn't known was off. He thought about Margaret, who was perceptive and capable and honest, and about what it meant that he liked her, genuinely liked her, and could not make himself want what they were supposed to be building. I thought about a 17-year-old girl and 112 acres in Lancaster County, and 12 years of following a pattern. He thought about Silas Grant riding away down the road and looking back at the house. He thought about the unsigned documents sitting in William Thayer's leather satchel in Helena. He had a letter to write. He pulled out a clean sheet and wrote to Thayer full authorization to use his statement, and Clara Bennett's, and anything else the lawyer needed. He wrote it without hesitation, and when it was done, he sat back and looked at what he'd written and felt something settle in his chest. The particular settling that happens when you stop weighing a decision and make it. He sealed the letter. Then he sat in the warm, quiet study in the house that had not been warm or quiet like this in 4 years, and he listened to the last sounds of Clara finishing her evening round and the front door of his house checking locked and her footsteps on the stairs. He did not know yet what any of it meant, but he knew that something was coming from Grant, from Helena, from Margaret, from the particular charge in the air of his own home, and that when it arrived, he would not be facing it the same man who had posted a notice on Elspeth Morton's board 13 days ago. He was not sure yet what man he was instead. But the house was warm. The fires were properly banked. And somewhere in the east wing, Clara Bennett was sleeping in a borrowed room in a house that she had made into something neither of them had a word for yet. Nathan put out the study lamp and went to bed. The letter from William Thayer arrived 3 days after Nathan sent his authorization, and it did not come alone. It came with a second envelope tucked inside the first, sealed separately, with Clara's name written on the front in a handwriting that was not Thayer's. Thayer's note said only, "This was delivered to my office yesterday by a man I did not recognize. He said Miss Bennett would know who it was from. I thought it best to forward it rather than open it. Be careful, Nathan." Nathan brought both letters to the kitchen. Clara was at the table going over the household accounts. The same methodical precision she brought to everything, and she looked up when he came in. He handed her the outer letter first. She read Thayer's note. Then she looked at the second envelope, the one with her name on it, and her hands went very still. She knew the handwriting. Nathan saw it happen. The recognition, the specific quality of stillness that moves through a person when something they've been dreading has finally arrived. She set Thayer's letter on the table and held the second envelope for a moment without opening it. "Do you want me to leave?" Nathan asked. "No," she said. She broke the seal. She read it once. Then she set it flat on the table and looked at Nathan with an expression so controlled it told him exactly how much effort the control was costing her. "It's from Ellery Cross," she said. "He knows where I am. He knows I've seen Grant's documents. He says—" She stopped, looked at the letter again as if she needed to confirm what she'd read. "He says if I give any sworn statement to any territorial legal proceeding, he'll file a slander complaint against me in Nebraska that will follow me to every territory in the West." She put the letter down. "He knows judges. He knows clerks. He says he can make certain I never get hired anywhere again." The kitchen was very quiet. "He's threatening you," Nathan said. "Yes." "To protect Grant." "Yes." She said it flat and even, but underneath the evenness was something older and darker, and Nathan could hear it the way you hear water running under ice. "They are connected. This confirms it. Cross doesn't send this letter unless he and Grant are communicating, and Grant doesn't contact Cross unless he's panicking." She pressed her palm flat on the letter. "He's panicking because your documents weren't signed. Because Thayer filed the contest. Because someone actually looked at the structure instead of just trusting the explanation." "Then we have him," Nathan said. "We have evidence of a connection," she said. "That's not the same as proof of fraud. It's closer. Cross is careful. He's been doing this for 20 years, and he hasn't been caught yet." She stood up from the table. She walked to the window and stood there with her back to him, and Nathan could see from the set of her shoulders that she was doing something very private and very necessary, pulling herself together around something that had hit harder than she'd let show. "He threatened my father too," she said very quietly. "Before the signing. He said my father would be reported for a filing irregularity if he caused trouble. My father didn't know enough to know the threat was hollow." A pause. "I was 17. I didn't know either." "You know now," Nathan said. She turned around. "He's not bluffing about the Nebraska judges," she said. "Cross has real connections there. A complaint like that, even a false one, would follow me." She held his gaze. "What I'm telling you is that giving this statement has a real cost, for me, not a theoretical one." "I know that," Nathan said. "I need you to understand it before I decide." "I understand it," he said. "And I want you to know that whatever you decide, I will not think less of you for it. If you pull back from this, you have every right. You have more right than anyone." She looked at him for a long moment. The particular way she looked at him when she was weighing something real, not performing the weighing, but actually doing it. "If I don't give the statement," she said, "those two men who already signed Grant's documents lose their water rights in the first dry year. Probably 2 or 3 years from now when the mechanism activates and they have no legal recourse left." She paused. "They have families. I saw the property records Thayer sent. One of them has 4 children." Nathan said nothing. "I've been following this pattern for 12 years, Clara said. "I've been waiting for a case where the proof was clean enough to hold up. This is the cleanest I've ever seen." She picked up Cross's letter from the table and folded it precisely. "He sent this letter to scare me, which means he's scared." She looked at Nathan. "I'm giving the statement." She walked past him and went to find paper and pen. Nathan stood in the kitchen alone for a moment, holding the fact of her the size of what she'd just decided and feeling something in his chest that he recognized and did not quite know what to do with. He went to find Thomas. He found him in the equipment barn, which was where Thomas went when he was working through something. The same way Nathan went to his study and Clara went to the kitchen. "Grant's not going to come back with a conversation," Nathan said. "He's going to come at this differently. Through Cross. Through legal filings. Possibly through something more personal." Thomas looked up from the saddle he was cleaning. "Personal how?" "Clara. He'll go after Clara's credibility, her history." Thomas set down the saddlecloth. "What do we do?" "Thayer needs to move, fast, before Cross can file anything in Nebraska that muddies the water." Nathan leaned against the barn wall. "I need you to ride into Broken Spur today and send 2 telegrams. One to Thayer, tell him about Cross's letter. Tell him to expedite, tell him we have the connection between Cross and Grant documented now in writing. Second telegram to Judge Harlan Fossey in Helena. I've done business with Fossey. He's a territorial judge who doesn't owe Grant any favors." Thomas was already reaching for his coat. "What do I tell Fossey?" "Tell him Nathan Cole requests a meeting at his earliest convenience regarding a water rights fraud case with territorial implications." Nathan paused. "Tell him it's urgent." Thomas left inside 10 minutes. Nathan went back to the house. Clara was at the desk in the sitting room, writing her statement in the same clear, economical hand she used for everything. She wrote without stopping, without crossing out, without hesitation, which told Nathan she'd been composing it in her head for longer than this morning. Maybe for 3 years. He left her alone. I went to the dining room, the room he'd avoided for years, the long table with the empty chairs, and he sat at the head of it and thought about a man named Ellery Cross and a man named Silas Grant, and 20 years of the same structure applied across different territories to different assets, and he thought about what kind of person constructs something like that. What kind of person looks at the land a family has built and sees first and only an instrument for their own gain. He thought about James Bennett, who couldn't read, who trusted the man explaining the documents to him, who died 3 years after losing his land. He thought about Clara at 17 standing in the aftermath, deciding to learn everything. The anger came then clean and solid, like the kind that doesn't burn hot, but goes deep and stays long. Nathan Cole was not a man who acted from anger. He was a man who identified problems and solved them. But this particular anger was useful because it was accurate. It pointed directly at the thing that needed to be fixed and did not waver. He went back to his desk and started writing his own statement. It was Margaret who found him there 2 hours later. She knocked and came in when he said enter, and she looked at the papers spread across his desk and said, "You're preparing legal documents." "Yes." She came in and sat in the chair across from him, the way a person sits when they intend to be useful. "Thomas told me you sent telegrams to Helena. Is this about the water rights documents Grant presented?" Nathan looked at her. "He mentioned it to me last week," she said. "I asked him how the ranch was doing, and he told me the truth, which I appreciate." She folded her hands in her lap. "I also talked to Miss Bennett yesterday." Nathan set down his pen. "What did she tell you?" "She told me about Nebraska," Margaret said. "About her father, about Ellery Cross." She paused. "She didn't tell me she was planning to give a legal statement. I heard that from Thomas just now." She looked at Nathan steadily. "She's taking a serious risk." "I know. The kind of risk a person takes when they believe in something more than they fear for themselves." Margaret held his gaze. "Or when they believe in someone." The room was quiet. Nathan did not look away from Margaret's eyes, because he was not that kind of man, and because she deserved better than that. "Margaret," he said. "Don't," she said quietly. Not sharply, just firmly. "Don't apologize. I can see what's happened here clearly enough. I'd rather we just speak plainly." A pause. "All right," he said. "When my father arranged this," she said, "I agreed because it seemed reasonable. You seemed like a reasonable man, a serious man." She looked at her hands briefly. "I didn't expect to come here and find that I actually like you. That makes this slightly more complicated." She looked up. "But I also didn't expect to meet a woman like Clara Bennett, and watching you with her for the past week." She stopped, found the word. "You're not the same person you were when I arrived. Something's been woken up in you, and it isn't me that woke it." Nathan said nothing. "A woman doesn't want to be married to a man who is quietly wishing she were someone else," Margaret said. "Even if he's kind about it, even if he never says it out loud, it's not enough." She stood. "Whatever happens with this legal business, whatever happens with Grant and Cross and the water rights, sort yourself out about Miss Bennett. Because carrying that unsaid is going to cost you both more than it needs to." She walked to the door. "Margaret," Nathan said. She stopped. "You're a remarkable person," he said. She looked at him for a moment over her shoulder, and something in her face was complicated and real and honest. "Yes," she said, "I am. And I intend to find someone who notices that first." She almost smiled. "Sort it out, Nathan." She left. Nathan sat very still at his desk for a long time. Then he picked up his pen and finished his statement. The blow from Silas Grant came the next morning, and it came not through legal channels, but through Broken Spur itself. Nathan heard about it from Pete Dawson, who had been in town for supplies, and came back looking like he'd swallowed something that disagreed with him. "People are talking," Pete said, standing in the yard, not quite meeting Nathan's eyes. "About Miss Bennett, in the saloon and over at Morton's." Nathan went very still. "What are they saying? That she's—" Pete stopped. Started again. "Someone's been putting it around that she was let go from a household in Laramie for stealing. That she took cash from a family's accounts and left before they could have her arrested." Pete finally looked at Nathan. "It's not true, is it?" "No," Nathan said. "It is not. I didn't think so. But it's spreading. Mrs. Cutler at the boarding house said she heard it from the man who runs the assay office, who heard it from a stranger who came in 2 days ago and was asking about Miss Bennett by name." 2 days ago, right after Nathan's telegram to Thayer, right after Cross received word that the statement was coming. "Who was this stranger?" Nathan asked. "I don't know. Nobody seemed to know his name. He had a Kansas City accent, is what Mrs. Cutler said. Kansas City. Cross's company was out of Kansas City." Nathan turned and walked straight to the kitchen. Clara was there. She looked at his face and set down what she was holding. "It started," he said. He told her. He watched her face go through several things very quickly. Recognition, anger, something that might have been fear for just a moment, and then the same quality of focused stillness she'd brought to Grant's documents. "A stranger from Kansas City," she said. "Asking about me by name." "Yes. He'll have documents," she said. "Forged ones. A false complaint from Laramie. Something on paper that looks official." She pressed both palms on the counter. "This is how Cross operates. He poisons the well before the legal fight so that any testimony from me looks like it comes from a woman with a criminal history." "Thayer needs to know today," Nathan said. "Yes. And we need someone in Broken Spur to start correcting the story. Someone people trust." She looked at him. "Thomas." "Thomas," Nathan agreed. "And you need to be seen with me, in town, publicly. If you distance yourself even slightly, the story takes hold. If you treat me exactly as you have been, it gives people pause." "I wasn't planning to distance myself," Nathan said. She looked at him. "I know," she said. "I'm just saying it out loud so we're agreed." They were agreed. Thomas went to town within the hour. Nathan knew Thomas had a way of talking that didn't sound like defending someone. It sounded like setting a record straight, and people responded to it differently than they responded to an employer vouching for hired help. Thomas would be credible in a way Nathan couldn't be on this particular question. What Nathan did instead was saddle his horse and ride to Broken Spur himself, and he took Clara with him. They rode in together, which was not something Nathan had done with any employee in 11 years of running the ranch. He tied both horses at the rail outside Morton's store and walked in with Clara and bought flour and coffee and salt and a new length of rope. And he talked to Elspeth Morton with the easy familiarity of a man who is entirely comfortable with where he stands. And when Mrs. Morton mentioned carefully that she'd heard some talk about Miss Bennett, Nathan looked at her with the particular quality of attention that Nathan Cole was capable of when he wanted someone to understand him precisely. "Whatever you heard," he said, "is false. Clara Bennett is the most competent person I've hired in 11 years. Anyone in Broken Spur wants to know my opinion of her work, they can ask me directly." Mrs. Morton blinked. "Of course," she said. "Of course, Mr. Cole." They left. On the porch, Clara stood for a moment without speaking. "Thank you," she said finally. "Don't thank me for the truth," Nathan said. She looked at him sidelong, and he saw something move through her eyes that she didn't entirely manage to keep contained. It wasn't a soft look. It wasn't a melting kind of look. It was something harder and more honest than that, the look of a person who has been dealt with honestly and doesn't quite know yet how to receive it without armor. She put her armor back on in about 2 seconds and got on her horse. He got on his. They rode back to the ranch. The telegram from Thayer arrived that afternoon, and it changed everything. Thayer had found the connection. It was in the corporate filings. An investment company out of Kansas City called Meridian Land Trust, the company that had been behind the Nebraska operation with Ellery Cross, had filed a name change and a restructuring in 1878. The new company was called Western Consolidated Resource Partners. The principal investor in Western Consolidated listed in the territorial filings in Montana was Silas Grant. Same structure, same legal mechanism, different name, different territory, different assets. Ellery Cross and Silas Grant were not just connected, they were partners, had been for at least 14 years, and Thayer had found 3 other states where the pattern had run. Nebraska, Kansas, Colorado. Properties taken water rights, stripped grazing access, eliminated all through the same beneficial use override structure. More than a dozen families. Some of the cases were old enough to have been forgotten. Some of the people affected had moved on and didn't know there was a pattern. Clara had been right. She'd been right for 12 years, and she'd been waiting for the evidence to catch up with what she knew. Nathan brought the telegram to her in the kitchen, which was where she always was, and he set it on the table without speaking. She read it. He watched her read it. She read it through to the end. Then she set it down and pressed her hand flat over it, palm down, like she was making sure it was real. Like she needed to feel the paper to believe the words on it. Her eyes were very bright. She did not cry. She was not the kind of person who cried easily, and Nathan had understood that about her within the first 3 days. But her eyes were bright and her jaw was tight, and she kept her hand flat on the telegram for a long moment. "They can prove it," she said. "Yes. Cross, Grant, the whole structure. Thayer says he's filing in territorial court within the week. He's going to Judge Fossey directly. He also says—" Nathan paused. "He says the two men who already signed Grant's documents may have grounds for rescission if they act quickly. The fraud vitiates the contracts." "They have to know," Clara said immediately. "Someone has to tell them." "Thayer's handling it. They have families." She looked up at Nathan. "They didn't know. It's the same thing that happened to my father. They trusted the explanation and signed." Her voice was very steady and very fierce at once. "They can't lose their water rights because they trusted the wrong man." "They won't," Nathan said. "Not if Thayer moves fast enough." "Is he going to move fast enough?" "I've offered to pay for whatever it costs to make that happen," Nathan said. Clara looked at him. He met her gaze without elaboration. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "No," he said. "I didn't." She looked at him for a long moment with that complicated, contained expression, the one that had something under it that she was very careful about showing. Then she picked up the telegram and folded it precisely and held it. 12 years, she said very quietly. Not to Nathan exactly, to the room, to herself, to the version of her that was 17 and standing in the wreckage of her father's land and deciding what to do about it. 12 years. "I know," Nathan said. "I wanted to say something more." He was aware of that want with a precision that surprised him. He was not a man who often knew exactly what he wanted to say, and lacked the architecture to say it. But this was one of those times. What he wanted to say was something about what it meant that she'd carried this for 12 years and kept going. Something about the kind of strength that doesn't announce itself. Something about what it did to him personally to see the moment she read that telegram and understood that the evidence had finally caught up with the truth she'd been holding alone. I didn't say any of it. It wasn't the moment. He wasn't sure yet what the moment would be or when it would come, but he knew enough about timing to know that this wasn't it. "I'm going to write to Thayer tonight," he said. "Anything you need in that letter, anything you want him to know about Nebraska, about Cross's methods, tell me now, and I'll include it." She nodded. "Let me write it myself. I'll have it to you by tonight." He left her with the telegram and went back to his desk. The next 2 days moved fast. Judge Harlan Fossey's response to Nathan's telegram arrived the following morning. Fossey would receive Nathan and his legal representative in his chambers in Helena in 4 days. He had seen Thayer's filing. "I was," the telegram said in the careful language of a territorial judge, "very interested in the matters raised." Grant showed up at the ranch one more time. He came in the early morning before the household was fully active, and Nathan met him on the porch. This time Nathan didn't invite him in at all. Grant looked different this time. The smile was present, but it was working harder than before, which meant something underneath it had shifted. "Nathan," Grant said, "I think we may have gotten off on the wrong foot. The consortium's offer is still on the table. I'm willing to renegotiate some of the terms if there are concerns." "There are concerns," Nathan said. "What would it take to address them?" "A full withdrawal of the filing," Nathan said, "and restoration of the water rights agreements for the 2 property owners who've already signed." The smile did not waver, but something behind Grant's eyes moved fast. "That's a significant ask." "It is." "Nathan, I don't think you understand the complexity of the consortium's position." "I understand it precisely," Nathan said. "And so does Judge Fossey." The smile stopped. It didn't just adjust, it stopped. For about 3 seconds, Silas Grant stood on Nathan Cole's porch with no smile on his face, and in those 3 seconds, Nathan saw clearly who the man actually was. The calculation that ran behind the charm. The specific quality of cold intelligence that had built a fraud operation across 4 states over 14 years and never gotten caught. Then the smile came back. "We should discuss this in more detail," Grant said. "We have nothing to discuss," Nathan said. "You can discuss it with William Thayer and Judge Fossey in Helena." Grant held his gaze for a moment. Then he turned and walked to his horse and rode away, and he did not look back. Nathan stood on the porch and watched him go, and felt the way you feel when a thing you've been braced for has finally broken open into the open air. Not relief exactly, because the work wasn't done, but a particular solidity. The moment where a fight stops being potential and becomes actual, and you know exactly where you stand. He went inside. Clara was in the kitchen. She was standing at the counter holding a cup of coffee and looking at the doorway, and when Nathan came in, she said, "He came." "He came," Nathan said. "What happened?" "I told him to take it to Thayer and Fossey." He looked at her. "He's not going to stop. He's too invested in this to walk away now." "I know," she said, "but he's exposed now. Every move he makes from here makes it worse for him." She set down the cup. "He's going to go after me directly. Before Helena. He'll try to file Cross's complaint in Nebraska before the hearing." "Thayer's already filed a preemptive challenge in the Nebraska Territorial Court," Nathan said. "Based on the fraud evidence, Cross can't file anything in Nebraska right now without it looking like retaliation for the Montana case. It ties their hands at least temporarily." Clara absorbed this. Then she said, "You and Thayer planned that." "Yes." "When?" "The telegram I sent 3 days ago, while you were writing your statement." She looked at him steadily. "You were managing both tracks at once." "I was trying to," he said. "I'm not a lawyer. Thayer's carrying most of it." "But you thought of it," she said. "Protecting the Nebraska flank while opening the Montana front." He said nothing. She picked up her coffee again. And in the brief quiet between them in the warm kitchen on the morning after Silas Grant had stood on the porch and shown his real face for 3 seconds, something shifted in Clara Bennett's expression that hadn't been there before. Something that was less like the careful, contained look she usually wore, and more like the look of a person who is revising an assessment they'd thought was final. She'd trusted Nathan with the truth about Nebraska. She'd trusted him enough to give the statement. She'd trusted him enough to ride into town beside him. But this was something different. This was the moment she understood that he'd been thinking about her the same way she thought about a problem, not just reacting to it, but running ahead of it, seeing the angles before they arrived. She didn't say anything about it. Neither did he. But the kitchen held it the way. The kitchen held everything that mattered between them in the warmth and the smell of coffee, and the ordinary morning sounds of a house that had learned in the space of 3 weeks how to be alive. There were 2 days until Helena. Margaret Whitfield came to Nathan that evening and told him she was leaving in the morning. She said it plainly, the way she did everything. She was taking the stage back toward St. Louis, with a stop in Helena, and she had already arranged her travel. She said it without drama, and without recrimination, and with the particular dignity of a woman who has looked at a situation clearly and made a decision based on what she actually saw rather than what she'd hoped for. "This isn't what either of us thought it would be," she said. "And that's all right. Things don't always go the way they're arranged." "Margaret," Nathan said. "No," she said. "Don't. I told you before, don't apologize for something that isn't a failing. It's just the truth." She looked at him with an expression that was clear and a little tired and not unkind. "You need to tell her," she said. "Whatever it is you're carrying around this house without saying, you need to say it. There's a lot happening right now." "There's always a lot happening," Margaret said. "That's not a reason. It's an excuse, and you know the difference." She put her hand briefly on his arm, the one gesture of warmth she'd allowed herself in the whole conversation. "Be well, Nathan. I mean that." She left for her room. Nathan stood in the hallway for a long moment. He thought about what she'd said. He thought about Thomas saying there are people you marry because it makes sense, and people who change the room they walk into. He thought about Clara at the kitchen table reading Thayer's telegram, with her palm pressed flat on the paper. He thought about 12 years. He thought about what it meant to carry something that long and then have someone finally running the other side of it with you. He went to the kitchen. It was late. The kitchen was clean and the fire was banked, and Clara was about to head upstairs, and she turned when he came in and started to say goodnight. "Clara," he said. She stopped. He looked at her across the kitchen. This woman who had walked through his door with one bag and a mended sleeve, and eyes that saw more than they let on, who had turned on the heat in this house, and named the problem in Grant's documents in 30 seconds, and decided to give her statement against a real threat, because 4 families she'd never met didn't deserve to lose what they'd built. "When this is over," he said, "I would like to talk to you about what comes next, For both of us. Not as your employer. She looked at him for a long time. What are you saying, Nathan? She said. Not coy, not performing uncertainty. Actually asking because she needed to hear it said plainly. I'm saying I don't want you to leave, he said. Not for the reason you think. Not because the house needs managing or the accounts need keeping. He held her gaze. I'm saying I think you belong here. And I'm saying I'd like to find out if you think so too, when the time is right for that conversation. The kitchen was very quiet. Clara stood very still. When this is over, she said finally. Not a rejection. A deferral. The same quality of careful she brought to everything that mattered. When this is over, he agreed. She nodded once. Then she went upstairs. Nathan stood in the kitchen alone, in the warm quiet of the house she'd built back to life, and felt the particular weight of something said that cannot be unsaid, not with dread, but with the specific gravity of a thing that is now real and has to be walked toward honestly. Helena was in 2 days. Grant was moving. Cross was moving. And somewhere in the east wing of the Cole Ranch, Clara Bennett was lying in the dark with 12 years of waiting at her back and 2 days of reckoning ahead of her. And Nathan Cole was finally fully terribly aware of what it would cost if they didn't win. He put out the kitchen lamp. He went to bed. He did not sleep. Margaret's stage left at 7 in the morning. Nathan was up before it. He stood on the porch and watched the wagon carry her trunk to the road, and Margaret came out of the house in her green traveling dress with her bag in her hand and stopped at the top of the porch steps. She looked at Nathan for a moment. Then she looked at the house behind him. The open curtains. The warm light from the kitchen window. The kitchen garden, coming up green along the south wall. And something moved across her face that was honest and a little wistful and not regret exactly, but the thing adjacent to regret that comes from seeing a life you might have had and understanding it was never quite yours to begin with. Take care of yourself, she said. You too, Nathan said. She went down the steps and got into the wagon. She didn't look back. Clara was in the kitchen when Nathan came inside, and she looked up from the stove and looked at his face and did not ask the question because she already knew the answer. She turned back to the stove and said quietly, "She's a good woman." "She is," Nathan said. "She deserves someone who chooses her first." "Yes," Nathan said. "She does." Silence. The fire in the stove. The smell of coffee. The ordinary sounds of a morning that was not ordinary at all. "We leave for Helena tomorrow," Clara said. "First light," Nathan said. She nodded and kept cooking. Nathan went to his desk and looked at the papers Thayer had sent and did not see a single word of them for 10 full minutes. They rode out before dawn. Or Nathan, Clara, and Thomas. Because Nathan didn't leave the ranch without Thomas when something important was at stake, and because Thomas had seen everything and could corroborate the timeline if Thayer needed it. They took the road north toward Helena with the mountains going from black to gray to rose ahead of them, and the three of them rode mostly without talking, which was the way people who trust one another travel when there's serious business at the end of the road. Clara rode well. Nathan had noticed it before, but had never had occasion to say it, and he said it now, somewhere around the second hour, when the road opened up and she moved the bay mare into a canter without being asked, like she'd read the road the same way he did. "You ride like you were born to it," he said. She glanced at him. "My father kept horses, before Nebraska." A pause. "I sold mine to make the trip to Montana." "The bay," Nathan said. "In the paddock." "Yours," she said. "I've been riding her because Thomas said it was all right." "She's yours," Nathan said. "Consider it part of the wage." Clara looked at him. "You can argue about it later," he said. "We've got bigger things today." She didn't argue, but she looked at the mare's neck for a moment, with something in her expression that was private and real, and had nothing to do with the legal business ahead, and Nathan looked away to give her the privacy of it. They reached Helena by mid-morning. Thayer met them outside his office on Last Chance Gulch, the main street, wearing his traveling suit and carrying the leather satchel that had apparently made every significant trip in his legal career. He shook Nathan's hand, nodded to Thomas, and looked at Clara with the same measuring attention he'd given her the first time. "Miss Bennett," he said, "your statement was the clearest piece of legal analysis I've received from a non-lawyer in 20 years of practice." "I've had 12 years to think about it," she said. "It shows." He turned and started walking. "Judge Fossey has agreed to an emergency hearing. This afternoon. Grant's attorney has been notified and will be present. I want to brief you all before we go in." They followed him inside. The briefing was fast and thorough. Thayer spread the documents on his conference table and walked them through the structure of the case in the efficient sequential way of a man who had organized his argument precisely and was not interested in wasting words. The core of it was clean. The corporate filings linking Meridian Land Trust to Western Consolidated Resource Partners, connecting Cross and Grant definitively across 14 years of operation. The identical legal mechanism applied in Nebraska, Kansas, Colorado, and now Montana. Clara's statement identifying the structure from her direct experience. Nathan's documents showing the unsigned Montana filing alongside the signed documents from the two affected property owners. And the letter from Ellery Cross to Clara, the threat letter, which Thayer had not initially planned to use but had changed his mind about. "That letter is the most damaging piece in this file," Thayer said. "It proves consciousness of guilt. A man who is running a legitimate operation does not send threatening letters to witnesses. Grant's attorney is going to try to discredit it, but the Kansas City postmark is verified, and the handwriting has been confirmed by a document examiner. I had look at it 2 days ago." Clara looked at the letter lying on the table. "Cross signed it himself," she said. "He did, which tells you something about his confidence that you wouldn't be able to do anything about it." Thayer looked at her over his spectacles. "He underestimated you. That's his problem now." "What about the Nebraska he threatened?" Nathan asked. "He filed it," Thayer said. The room went quiet. Nathan looked at Clara. Clara's face had gone very still. "When?" Nathan asked. "2 days ago, the same day Grant came to your ranch for the last time." Thayer's voice was even and deliberate. "He filed a complaint with the Nebraska Territorial Clerk alleging that Clara Bennett stole $80 from a household in Laramie in 1879. "That's fabricated," Nathan said. "Of course it is. There is no documentation of employment in Laramie in 1879. The household named in the complaint does not appear to exist. The alleged employer's name, a Mrs. Dorothea Price, is not in any record I can find in Wyoming Territory." Thayer looked at Clara. "He made it up. Poorly. He was moving fast because he was scared." "Can it be dismissed?" Nathan said. "I've already filed a motion to dismiss based on fabrication. It will take a few weeks to work through, but it will be dismissed." Thayer paused. "However, it will come up today. Grant's attorney will mention it. It's the only card they have against Miss Bennett's credibility, and they'll play it." Clara said, "Let them." Both men looked at her. "Let them bring it up," she said. "The fabrication is obvious. If they bring it into the room themselves, it looks like desperation. And the judge will be looking at a forged corporate restructuring document while they're talking about a made-up theft charge." She looked at Thayer. "Is Judge Fossey the kind of man who misses that contrast?" Thayer allowed himself a small, precise smile. "No," he said. "He is not." They walked to the courthouse. It was a stone building on the north end of town, solid and serious, in the way that territorial courthouses were when they were built to mean something, to signal that the law had arrived in a place that hadn't always had it. Nathan walked in with Clara on one side and Thomas on the other, and Thayer slightly ahead, and the bailiff showed them to the chamber where Fossey held his emergency hearings. Judge Harlan Fossey was 60 years old, large in a way that was all substance and no excess, with a white beard, trimmed close, and eyes that had the particular quality of attention that Nathan associated with men who had spent their careers separating what was true from what sounded true. He sat behind his bench and looked at each of them in turn as they came in without expression. Grant's attorney was already there. His name was Prescott. Hay and Nathan had met him twice before at territorial business meetings, a smooth, well-dressed man from Billings who was very good at making complicated things sound simple. He nodded at Nathan with the practiced neutrality of a man who intended to be cordial right up until the moment he was not. Grant himself was not in the room. That absence registered. Fossey opened the hearing without preamble. "This is an emergency evidence review," Fossey said. "Not a full trial. I've received filed documentation from Mr. Thayer and a response from Mr. Hay on behalf of Western Consolidated Resource Partners. I have questions for both sides, and I intend to ask them." He looked at Thayer. "You filed a contest of the water rights documentation submitted to the Territorial Land Office. State your basis." Thayer stood. "Your Honor, the documentation filed by Western Consolidated Resource Partners contains a clause in Section 4 that activates a beneficial use override of prior established water rights. Specifically, it supersedes a water easement filed in 1861 by the Cole family on Silver Creek in the northern sections of Gallatin County. The filing does not disclose this supersession. It represents the agreement as a partnership formalization of existing rights when it is in fact a taking of those rights." "That's one property," Fossey said. "It's one unsigned property. We have 2 additional signed documents from neighboring property owners showing the identical mechanism activated. Those property owners were not informed of the supersession clause." Thayer opened the satchel. "I also have corporate registration documents showing that Western Consolidated Resource Partners is a restructured continuation of a company called Meridian Land Trust, which operated an identical scheme in Nebraska, Kansas, and Colorado between 1869 and 1878. The principal in both companies is the same individual operating under different business names in different territories." Fossey held out his hand. Thayer gave him the corporate filings. Fossey read. The room was very quiet. Prescott Hay said, "Your Honor, the corporate restructuring in question is a routine business reorganization with no bearing on the Montana filing." Fossey did not look up. "I didn't ask you yet, Mr. Hay." Hay sat back down. Fossey read for 4 minutes. Long enough that Nathan could hear Thomas breathing beside him and could feel Clara's absolute stillness on his other side. Then Fossey looked up. "Miss Bennett," he said. Clara stood. "You prepared the statement in this file?" "Yes, Your Honor." "You have personal experience with a prior iteration of this document structure?" "Yes, Your Honor. In 1870, in Lancaster County, Nebraska, my father's homestead was taken through a document he signed that contained a grazing rights provision with an identical override mechanism. The document was presented by Ellery Cross, operating through Meridian Land Trust. The homestead was lost within 2 years of signing. And you identified this same mechanism in the Montana document?" "Immediately, Your Honor. The language in Section 4 is not similar to the Nebraska documents. It is identical. The same legal construction word for word." Fossey looked at Hay. "Mr. Hay, your response to that?" Hay stood. "Miss Bennett's history in Nebraska is noted, Your Honor, but it's personal grievance dressed as legal analysis. She has no legal training. Furthermore, I must bring to the court's attention that Miss Bennett is currently subject to a complaint filed in Nebraska territory alleging theft of funds from a prior employer." The room shifted. Nathan felt it the moment Grant's side had been planning the card they'd saved the attempt to cloud the water. Foss looked at the paper Hay held out without taking it. "What is the status of that complaint?" "It was filed 2 days ago with the Nebraska Territorial Clerk." 2 days ago. Fossey's voice had not changed in volume or tone, but something in it had gone flatter. "Mr. Thayer, are you aware of this complaint?" "Yes, Your Honor. I've filed a motion to dismiss in Nebraska on grounds of fabrication. The employer named in the complaint does not appear in any territorial record in Wyoming where the alleged incident occurred. The address listed is a vacant lot. There is no corroborating documentation of any kind." Thayer paused for exactly the right amount of time. "The complaint was filed 48 hours after Miss Bennett's sworn statement was submitted to this court." Foss looked at the corporate filings in his hand. He looked at Hay. "Mr. Hay," he said, "your client filed a threatening letter to a witness and a fabricated complaint against her within 1 week of her providing testimony in a water rights fraud case." He set the papers down. "This does not help your position." Hay started to speak. "Sit down," Fossey said. Hay sat. What happened next went quickly, in the way that things go quickly, when the weight of evidence has built up to a point where the conclusion becomes inevitable, and everyone in the room can feel it. Fossey asked 3 more questions, precise technical questions about the corporate filings, all of which Thayer answered directly, and Hay answered with qualifications that helped no one. Fossey asked Clara one additional question, whether she could identify in the Montana document the specific clause that would have activated the override in the event of a drought year. Clara stood and identified it in 30 seconds, reciting the clause from memory and explaining its mechanism in language so clear that even Thomas, who was not a legal man, nodded beside Nathan, as if to say, yes, that makes sense. Hay objected to Clara's testimony on grounds of lack of legal training. Fossey said, "She identified fraud that your client committed. That is not a question of legal training." He called a recess. He came back 20 minutes later. He issued a temporary injunction against Western Consolidated Resource Partners' water rights filing. The filing was suspended pending full investigation. The 2 signed agreements with the neighboring property owners were placed under a hold. No provisions of those agreements could be enforced while the investigation was active. And Fossey referred the matter of Ellery Cross's threatening letter and the fabricated Nebraska complaint to the Territorial Marshal's Office for criminal review. It was not a complete victory. It was not a full conviction or a permanent remedy or 12 years of wrongs made right in one afternoon. But it was the dam breaking. Nathan understood that when he heard it. He watched Prescott Hay gather his papers with the particular efficiency of a man whose case has just collapsed and who needs to communicate that to his client as quickly as possible. He watched Thayer make notes in his small leather journal without any visible satisfaction, but with the settled quality of a man who has done what he came to do. He watched Fossey leave the chamber without looking back, because Fossey was that kind of judge, not dramatic about the outcome, just exact about the process. And he watched Clara. She sat in her chair for a moment after Fossey left, very still. Her hands were in her lap, and she was looking at the place on the table where the documents had been, and her face was doing something that Nathan had never seen it do. It was letting go. Not falling apart, not breaking, but the specific release of something that has been held under tension for a very long time, the way a rope goes when the weight it's been bearing is finally set down. The line of her shoulders, the set of her jaw, the particular quality of her eyes, something in all of it eased, just slightly, just enough. Thomas said quietly, "You did that." Clara looked up. "You did," Thomas said. "You walked in here with 12 years, and you put it on the table, and it was enough." He looked at her with the directness of a man who does not say things he doesn't mean. "Your father would be proud of you, Miss Bennett." Clara's jaw tightened. She looked down at her hands. She said nothing for a moment. Then, "Thank you, Thomas." Nathan put nothing into words. He had not found the words yet for what he was feeling, which was large and complicated, and involved 12 years and 112 acres in Nebraska, and a girl who had decided to learn everything and was not the kind of thing that reduced easily. He put his hand on the table near hers, not touching just present. She looked at it. Then she looked at him, and whatever she saw in his face was enough, because she nodded once, the way she nodded when something was settled. They had supper in Helena before riding back. Thayer joined them at a restaurant on Last Chance Gulch, a real meal with real food. And for the first time in the 3 weeks Nathan had known her, Clara sat at a table and let someone else do all the work. She ordered, she ate, she drank her coffee. She sat back in her chair the way a person sits when they have finally stopped bracing for something. Thayer talked about the next steps. The full investigation would take weeks. The Nebraska fabrication case would need to be formally dismissed. The 2 neighboring property owners would need independent legal counsel to understand their options. There was more to do. There was always more to do. But underneath all of that, something had shifted permanently. Grant's structure was exposed. Cross's letter was in front of a territorial judge and a marshal's office. The water rights were protected. And the same document that had destroyed a family in Nebraska in 1870 had been identified, named, and stopped in Montana in 1882. On the ride back, the 3 of them were quiet. It was Thomas who spoke first around the halfway point, when the mountains were dark ahead of them and the stars had come out clear. He said, "First frost will be early this year. I can feel it in the air." "The north pasture fencing is done," Nathan said. Cattle rotation's ready, Thomas said. We'll be fine. Clara said, the kitchen garden will need to come in before the frost. I'll get Pete Dawson to help me tomorrow. It was such an ordinary thing to say. After everything, the hearing, the injunction, the 12 years, the letter from Cross, the moment in the courtroom when Clara had cited that clause from memory, and the judge had looked at Hay like the man had shown up to a gunfight with a pocket knife. After all of it, Clara's first domestic thought was the kitchen garden. Thomas caught Nathan's eye in the dark and said nothing, but his expression said it. Keep her. They reached the ranch close to midnight. Thomas took the horses. Nathan and Clara walked to the house, and Nathan opened the door and stood back to let her through, and when she stepped inside and stopped in the front hall, the hall with the curtains that had been closed so long, the rod fell off the wall. The hall that now smelled like bread and wood smoke and whatever it smells like when a house has started being lived in again. She stood still for a moment. Nathan closed the door behind them. You should sleep, he said. In a minute, she said. She was looking at the hallway, at the lamp burning low on the side table, at the things she'd changed and fixed and made right in the past 3 weeks. I want to check the fire. She went to the sitting room to check the fire. He stood in the hall and listened to her do it. The small sounds of her banking it properly the way she always did, never leaving a fire to chance, and he thought about what Thomas had said. Keep her. About what Margaret had said. You need to tell her. About what he himself had said standing in this kitchen 4 days ago. I don't want you to leave. She came back out of the sitting room and stopped in the hall. They were 3 feet apart. The fire's fine, she said. Good, he said. Neither of them moved. Nathan, she said. Clara, he said. And then the thing that had been building in the space between them for 3 weeks through the kitchen and the documents and the threat letter and the courtroom and the ride home under the Montana stars found the surface. I meant what I said, he said. What I said in the kitchen, 4 days ago. She looked at him. I know you did, she said. I need you to know that it has nothing to do with what you did today, or what you know about land documents, or what you did to this house. He met her gaze steadily. Those things matter. They matter a lot. But they're not why. Then why? She said. Not challenging, asking. The way she always asked, actually wanting the answer. Because you walked through my door with a mended sleeve and 1 bag, he said. And you told me the truth about this house in the first 30 seconds. And you've told me the truth about everything since then. He paused. I haven't had someone do that in a very long time. Tell me the truth without wanting something from me in return. Clara was quiet. I want something from you, she said. I know, he said. You want to be chosen, not needed, not hired, not kept. She looked at him. Chosen, he said. That's what I'm saying. She held his gaze for a long time, long enough that Nathan felt the full weight of the silence, which was not empty, but full of 12 years, and Nebraska and Silas Grant, and the kitchen garden, and 3 weeks of truth-telling in a house that had learned how to be warm again. I'm not an easy person, she said. I haven't noticed you trying to be, he said. I'll argue with you when I think you're wrong. Good, I'm frequently wrong. Something moved through her expression, not quite a smile, but the thing that precedes one. I don't need rescuing, she said. Clara, Nathan said, you just rescued me, and 12 years of other people I never met. I think we can agree on who's doing the rescuing around here. She looked at him for one more moment. Then she closed the 3 feet between them. She did it the way she did everything, without performance, without hesitation, exactly as far as she meant to go. She put her hand against his chest, just briefly, and looked up at him. Ask me properly, she said. When the time is right. Not tonight. Not tonight, he agreed. She nodded. She took her hand back. She went upstairs. Nathan stood in the front hall of the house that had been a shell and was now somehow in the space of 3 weeks. Something he had not had a word for until Clara Bennett had walked through his door. He had the word for it now. Home. He put out the lamp. He went to bed. He slept 6 hours straight for the first time in 4 years. The weeks that followed had the quality of a thing settling into itself. Not easy exactly, because nothing about the legal situation was easy, but solid, grounded. Like ground that's been turned and planted and is now doing what ground does when it's been properly tended. Thayer worked fast. The Nebraska fabrication case was dismissed inside 2 weeks. The clerk who had accepted Cross's complaint was discovered to have a prior financial relationship with Meridian Land Trust. He'd taken payment to process the filing without verification, and that discovery added to the mounting evidence in the Montana case, tipped the Territorial Marshal's office from interested to active. Ellery Cross was located in Kansas City. He did not come quietly, but he came. The 2 neighboring property owners, the families with the signed documents, the 4 children were notified of their options under Thayer's counsel. Both families moved to rescind. Both rescissions were granted based on the fraud finding. Their water rights were restored. Nathan heard about the second family when Thayer sent the confirmation letter, and he took it to Clara in the kitchen without saying what it was. He just set it on the table. She read it. She set it down. She said, "Both of them." "Both of them," Nathan said. She put her hand over her eyes for a moment. Just a moment. Then she took her hand down, and her face was clear, and she looked at Nathan and said, "Good." Just that. Good. The way she said things when they were too big for more words. Silas Grant disappeared from Broken Spur sometime in the 3rd week of October. Nobody saw him leave. His office was cleared out, and his horse was gone from the livery, and a man in Helena reported seeing someone matching his description boarding a train east, and after that, the trail went cold. Thayer said it didn't matter. The injunction held regardless of Grant's location, and the marshal would find him eventually, and the evidence was on record, whether or not the man was in the territory to answer for it. The kitchen garden came in before the first frost. Clara and Pete Dawson spent a full day on it, and by the end, there were carrots and kale and late parsnips and a bushel of dried herbs hanging in the kitchen pantry. And Pete Dawson, who had not said much about anything in the 3 months he'd been working the ranch, came in from that day, looking like a person who'd learned something important about what work felt like when it mattered. Bill Crane's hand was fully healed. Thomas turned 63 in October, and Clara made him a proper birthday supper. Not a fancy one, but the kind of supper that knows what a person likes. And Thomas ate 2 helpings and said nothing, because Thomas communicated through actions, and the action he chose was to come back to the kitchen the next morning before the ranch day started and say to Clara with his hat in his hands, "Thank you for everything this year, Miss Bennett. This place is different with you in it." Clara said, "It's different because of everyone in it, Thomas." Thomas put his hat back on and went out. Nathan was standing in the doorway and heard the whole exchange and did not announce himself. He went back to his desk. He wrote a letter. I didn't send it right away. He held it for 3 days, which was not like him. Nathan Cole was not a man who held letters, but this one required holding. Then on a Tuesday morning in late October, when the frost had come and gone overnight, and the kitchen had the particular warmth of a stove that's been burning since before daylight, he brought it to the kitchen. Clara was at the table. He set the letter in front of her. She looked at him. "Read it," he said. She picked it up. She read it. He watched her face while she read. He saw the moment she understood what it was, what it actually was, not a business letter or a legal document or a household matter. He saw something happen in her expression that was quiet and careful and very real. She put it down. She looked at the table for a moment. Then she looked at Nathan. "This is the proper asking," she said. "Yes," he said. "You're sure," she said, not doubting him, checking. Because Clara Bennett checked. Because she had learned the hard way that what people said and what they meant were not always the same thing, and she had built 12 years of careful reading on that knowledge. "I've been sure," Nathan said, "since the morning you walked through my door and told me I didn't need a cook. I just didn't have the right to say so until now." She looked at the letter one more time. She said, "Yes." Just that. The way she said things. Nathan sat down across from her at the kitchen table, and they sat there for a moment in the warm, ordinary morning of the house, the stove ticking the coffee hot, the frost melting off the kitchen garden outside, and neither of them said anything for a while, because there was nothing that needed saying. The thing was decided. It had been decided in a way from the first morning. Not romantically, not in a story way, but in the real way that real things get decided through 3 weeks of truth-telling and document reading and riding into town together and standing in a courthouse and coming home in the dark and all the small ordinary things between. Nathan had a ranch. Clara had 12 years and 112 acres in Nebraska and a knowledge of land documents that had just helped break a 14-year fraud operation across 4 states. Together they had a house that was warm. Thomas knocked on the kitchen doorframe and stopped when he took in the two of them at the table with the letter between them, and his face did the thing it did when he understood something quickly and chose not to make it complicated. "Good," he said. "About time." And he went back out to the yard. Nathan looked at Clara. Clara looked at Nathan. And in the warm, ordinary, irreplaceable kitchen of the Cole Ranch in Gallatin County, Montana Territory, in the autumn of 1882, the thing that had started with a notice board and a mended sleeve and 30 seconds of truth arrived at the place it had always been going. They were married on a Saturday in November, 3 weeks after Nathan's letter and Clara's single-word answer at the kitchen table. It was not a large wedding. Neither of them wanted large. Clara had no family left to invite, and Nathan's nearest relatives were cousins in Ohio. He hadn't spoken to in a decade, and neither of them was the kind of person who needed an audience to make something real. What they needed was a preacher, 2 witnesses, and the truth, and they had all 3. Thomas stood as Nathan's witness. Hannah Bird, the Cherokee woman who had given Clara the seedlings for the kitchen garden in September, stood as Clara's. Preacher Aldous from Broken Spurs Church performed the ceremony in the front parlor of the Cole Ranch, in the room with the curtains that now stayed open in front of the fireplace that burned properly because Clara had cleaned the flue in her first week, and nobody had let it go cold since. Pete Dawson and Bill Crane stood in the doorway because the parlor was small and they hadn't been invited in, but they'd come inside anyway, and Nathan had looked at them and said nothing because there was nothing to say that the look didn't already cover. The ceremony was short. The vows were the standard ones, the words the preacher used for every couple in the territory. But when Nathan said them, he looked at Clara the way a man looks at someone he has thought about very carefully and chosen very deliberately. And when Clara said them, she looked back at him the way a woman looks when she has spent 12 years learning that trust is not a thing you give easily, and she is giving it anyway. When it was done, Thomas shook Nathan's hand once hard and turned to Clara and said, "Mrs. Cole," which was the first time anyone had said it, and something in Clara's face did a thing that was almost startlement, like the name landed differently than she'd expected. Like hearing herself called by it made the whole thing more real than the ceremony had. Hannah Bird put her arms around Clara without ceremony and held her for a moment, and Clara held back, and neither of them said anything, and the room understood that some things between women don't need words to be complete. Pete Dawson said from the doorway, "Are there gonna be biscuits?" Bill Crane hit him on the arm. Clara turned and said, "Yes, Pete, there are going to be biscuits." And the room laughed all of it. The genuine kind of laughter that means something is exactly right. And the Cole Ranch on a Saturday morning in November in 1882 held that laughter the way it had learned in 3 months to hold warmth, not as a guest, but as a permanent resident. The news from Thayer came 12 days after the wedding, and it was the news they had been waiting for. Ellery Cross had been formally charged by the Nebraska Territorial Court with land fraud, forgery of legal documents, and witness intimidation. The Kansas City Marshal's office, working with the Montana Territorial Marshal, had executed the arrest. Cross had retained a lawyer who was, according to Thayer's letter, claiming that his client had been misidentified and that the corporate documents were the result of standard business restructuring. Thayer's response to that, conveyed in the same letter with the precision of a man who had been practicing law for 30 years and was not impressed by evasion. The document examiner had confirmed identical handwriting across the Nebraska and Montana filings. The corporate registry showed Cross as a signatory in both Meridian Land Trust and Western Consolidated Resource Partners. And a former clerk at the Kansas Territorial Land Office had come forward following Cross's arrest to confirm that he had been paid to process a filing in 1874 without standard verification. The clerk coming forward was the part that mattered most. Nathan read that section aloud to Clara at the kitchen table. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "Someone finally talked," she said. "Someone finally had reason to," Nathan said. Cross being arrested made talking safer than staying quiet. Clara looked at the letter. What about Grant? Thayer had addressed this too. Silas Grant had been located in Chicago, attempting to establish a new business entity under a variation of the Western Consolidated name. The territorial marshal had coordinated with Chicago authorities. Grant had been detained. Extradition proceedings were underway. "He ran," Clara said. "He ran," Nathan confirmed. "Men like that always run," she said. "When it's real, when the evidence is real, and the judge is real, and there's no one left to bribe, they run. Because the whole thing they've built is about never being in a room where they can't control the outcome." She set her coffee down. "He doesn't know how to be in a room he can't control." "He's about to learn," Nathan said. Clara nodded slowly. She picked up her coffee. She sat with it. And then she said something that Nathan had not heard her say before in 3 months of knowing her, in all the conversations about Nebraska and Cross and the documents and the courtroom and the kitchen garden. She said it quietly, looking at her hands, and she said it the way people say things they've been carrying a long time and have finally set down somewhere permanent. "My father was a good man," she said. "He wasn't educated. He wasn't sophisticated. He trusted people because that was his nature." She paused. "That nature was used against him. And for 12 years I've been angry about that, not just at Cross and Grant, but at the world that let it happen. At the way things are built to favor the people who know the language and leave everyone else to sign what they don't understand." Nathan waited. "I'm still angry," she said. "I don't think that goes away. But I think—" She stopped, found the word. "I think he can rest now, whatever rest means. He can rest because someone finally looked at the documents and named it for what it was. And there are 2 families in this territory who still have their water because of it." She looked up at Nathan. "That's what I needed. For him." Nathan looked at his wife across the kitchen table. He said, "James Bennett's daughter did that." Clara held his gaze. "Yes," she said. "She did." The knock at the door came 2 days later in the early afternoon. Nathan was in the yard with Thomas going over the winter cattle plan, and Clara was in the kitchen, and Pete Dawson answered the door because he happened to be nearest to it, and he came to find Nathan in the yard with a look on his face that was trying to be neutral and not quite managing it. "Man at the door says he's from the Territorial Land Office," Pete said. "He's asking for Mrs. Cole." Nathan and Thomas looked at each other. Nathan went inside. The man from the Territorial Land Office was named Hendricks, mid-40s, with the careful demeanor of a bureaucrat who understands that his job is to convey information exactly and then leave. He was standing in the front hall with his hat in his hands and a leather envelope under his arm. Clara came out of the kitchen. Hendricks looked at her. "Mrs. Cole, formerly Miss Clara Bennett of Lancaster County, Nebraska." "Yes," Clara said. He held out the leather envelope. "I've been asked to deliver this to you personally. It's from the Nebraska Territorial Land Court in coordination with the Montana office. It's a restitution determination." Clara took the envelope. She did not open it immediately. She looked at Hendricks. "What is it determining?" "The court found that the original homestead filing for the Bennett property in Lancaster County, Nebraska was obtained through fraudulent documentation by Ellery Cross, operating as Meridian Land Trust. Under the Territorial Fraud Restitution Statute, the court has determined that the original filing rights revert to the surviving heir of the defrauded party." Hendricks met her gaze. "The land was sold 3 times since 1870. The current holder purchased it legitimately and cannot be dispossessed. But the court has ordered a financial restitution to the value of the property at the time of the original fraud, plus 12 years of assessed use value." Silence. Nathan stood very still. Clara held the envelope and did not move. "How much?" she said. Hendricks told her. Clara sat down. She didn't sit down dramatically. There was no chair behind her. She just sat on the hallway bench that Nathan had refinished in October and held the envelope in both hands and looked at the floor. Nathan came and sat beside her. "Clara," he said. She shook her head. Not dismissing him, just processing, just needing a moment for the size of it to fit somewhere inside her. Hendricks said carefully, "I can leave the paperwork and return tomorrow if—" "No," Clara said. She looked up. Her voice was entirely steady. "No, I'll sign now, whatever needs signing." She looked at Nathan. "Get Thayer on the line if you can. I want him to look at it first." "Of course," Nathan said. He sent a telegram to Helena within the hour. Thayer's response came back that evening. The restitution order was legitimate, properly filed, uncontestable. The amount was what Hendricks had said. Clara's signature on the acceptance form was all that was required. She signed it at the kitchen table that night. She set the pen down. She looked at the paper. 12 years, she said. Not sadly, not triumphantly, just acknowledging the distance. "What do you want to do with it?" Nathan asked. She looked at him. "What do you mean?" "The restitution," he said. "It's yours, not mine, yours. What do you want to do with it?" She thought about this seriously, the way she thought about everything serious. He could see her working through it, not the practicalities, not yet, but the meaning of the thing, what it represented, what it was asking her to decide. "There are other families," she said, "like mine, like the two here who almost lost their water rights. People who signed things they didn't understand, who lost what they'd built because the system was designed for people who already knew how it worked." She paused. "I want to do something about that." "What kind of something?" "A fund," she said. "Legal help. For homesteaders and small property owners who can't afford a lawyer like Thayer. Someone who can read the documents before the signing, not after." She looked at Nathan. "Thayer might know someone. A younger attorney who needs cases. Someone who'd do it for reasonable rates if the fund covered the gap." Nathan looked at his wife, at this woman who had just been handed 12 years' worth of reparation for the worst thing that had ever happened to her family, and whose first thought, her first real considered thought, was how to make sure it didn't happen to someone else. "I think," Nathan said, "that Thayer knows exactly the right person." Clara nodded. "Talk to him." "I will." He paused. "Tomorrow." "Tonight," she said. "Send the telegram tonight." He sent the telegram tonight. The winter came in properly after that. The kind of Montana winter that makes its intentions clear from the first week of December and doesn't apologize for them. The ranch went into its winter rhythm, the cattle rotation. Thomas had prepared the equipment, maintenance, the long cold quiet of the short days. But the house was not quiet. That was the difference. That was the thing that Nathan noticed every morning when he came downstairs before dawn and saw the kitchen light already on, already warm, already inhabited. The house had a sound to it now. Not loud. Clara was not a loud person, but present. Coffee being made, the stove being fed, the sound of boots on the floorboards, the sound of a person who had decided that this was where they were and meant it. Pete Dawson had taken to eating breakfast at the kitchen table most mornings, which had started as a convenience and had become, without anyone formally deciding it, simply how things were. Bill Crane came in for coffee most afternoons. Thomas was there every morning without exception. The kitchen had become what kitchens become when they're run by someone who understands that food is not just food, it's the thing that tells people they belong somewhere. Nathan watched this happening and did not comment on it because it did not need commenting on. It just needed to be allowed to be what it was. In January, the letter came from Thayer about the legal fund. He had found the attorney. A young woman named Frances Aldrich, 26 years old, freshly admitted to the territorial bar after reading law in her uncle's office for 4 years. She was in Bozeman. She was, Thayer wrote, the best legal mind he had encountered in a decade, and she was not finding it easy to establish a practice because she was a woman in a territory that was still making up its mind about women doing things that men did. Clara read that letter at the kitchen table and then read it again. "She's read law for 4 years, Clara said. "Yes," Nathan said. "She's already admitted to the bar." "Yes. She just needs cases. And someone to cover the gap when clients can't pay the full rate," Nathan said. "Which is what the fund does." Clara folded the letter very precisely. "Write to her," she said. Tell her the fund is established and she's the attorney of record. Tell her to start with Lancaster County, Nebraska. There are other families there, I know it." Nathan wrote the letter. Frances Aldrich wrote back within a week. Her letter was professional and brief, and at the end of it, in the last paragraph, she wrote, "I know what it is to try to do this work without the means to do it properly. I will not waste what you're offering." Clara read that paragraph twice. She said, "She'll be good." "Yes," Nathan said. "I think she will." The twist came in February, and it came from a direction neither of them had anticipated. A letter arrived from the Chicago court handling Silas Grant's extradition. Thayer had been copied on it and forwarded it to Nathan with a brief note. "Read carefully. I did not expect this. Grant had agreed to cooperate, not just with the Montana case, with everything." In exchange for a reduced sentence, Grant had provided a full accounting of the Meridian Land Trust and Western Consolidated Operations. The names, the properties, the clerks who had been paid, the judges who had been approached, the entire machinery of 14 years of fraud across 5 states. He had also provided in his accounting the names of 17 additional families who had been defrauded through the same mechanism. 17 families. Some of them had moved on. Some of them had rebuilt. Some of them, the letter indicated, had not recovered at all. But they were named. They were on record. And with Grant's cooperation, there was now a documented basis for restitution claims in each case. Nathan read the letter to Clara that evening. She sat very still through the entire reading. When he finished, she said, 17. "Yes. Cross took my father's land and then Grant took it further," she said. "They built the whole thing and ran it for 14 years, and there are 17 families." She was quiet for a moment. "Grant cooperated to save himself." "Yes," Nathan said. "I'm not going to be grateful to him for that," she said. "He didn't do it for those families. He did it for himself." "No," Nathan said. "He didn't do it for them." "But they get named anyway," Clara said. "They get to be on record anyway." She looked at Nathan. "That matters. Even if the reason is wrong, the result is right." Nathan looked at her. "The fund," he said. "The fund," she said. "Frances Aldrich, 17 families." She pressed her palm flat on the table, the gesture he knew, the one she made when something was real and she needed to feel it. "Send Thayer the authorization tonight. Whatever the fund needs to take all 17 cases." "That's going to take most of it," Nathan said. "Good," she said. "That's what it's for." He sent Thayer the authorization that night. He came back to the kitchen and found Clara standing at the stove making tea, not coffee tea, which she only made late in the evening when the day was done and the house was settled, and she turned when he came in and handed him a cup without asking. They stood in the kitchen in the quiet of the February evening, and Nathan thought about everything the past 4 months had contained: the notice board, the mended sleeve, the documents, the courtroom, the wedding, the restitution, the fund, and now 17 families with names on record who hadn't had them before. He thought about what it meant to start something. Not the ranch, not the cattle or the land or the business he'd built from his father's 4,000 acres. He'd built that alone, and it was good, and it was real, but it was also just a ranch. This was something different. This was the thing that got built when 2 people who had each been carrying something heavy for too long finally stopped carrying it alone and put it down in the same place. "Clara," he said. She looked at him. "What your father built mattered," he said. "What you built from what happened to him matters more." She held his gaze. She said, "We built it." He looked at her. "We built it," she said again, clearly, firmly, the way she said things she meant without apology. "Not just me, not just you. The 2 of us and Thomas and Pete Dawson and Thayer and Frances Aldrich and Hannah Bird, and every person who looked at those documents and told the truth about what they saw." She set her cup down. "That's how it gets built. Not by one person. By everyone who decides to tell the truth in the same direction." Nathan looked at his wife in the kitchen of the house she had brought back to life in the warmth of a fire she had laid, properly surrounded by the evidence of everything she had built and saved and made right, and he felt the full weight of what it meant that she had walked through his door with 1 bag and a mended sleeve and 30 seconds of truth, and that he had had the sense to step aside and let her in. He raised his cup. She raised hers. No toast. No words. Just the acknowledgement between two people who understood each other of a thing that was real and earned and permanent. Outside the Montana winter, pressed against the windows of the coal ranch, deep and cold and indifferent, the way wilderness is always indifferent. But inside the fire burned even, and the kitchen was warm, and the house that had been silent for 4 years held in every room the sound of people who had chosen to be there. Nathan Cole had spent 11 years building an empire out of raw ground and sheer will, and he had done it well, and it had not been enough. Clara Bennett had spent 12 years following a pattern across 3 territories and teaching herself everything she needed to know, and she had done it alone, and it had cost her more than it should have. But what they built together in 3 months and 1 kitchen and a stack of fraudulent documents and a courtroom in Helena and a legal fund and 17 families with names on record. What they built together was the thing neither of them had been able to build alone. Not an empire, not a case, not a house. A home that was built on truth, held together by choice, and strong enough to last every winter that came after. That was what they had built. That was what they were. And in the Coal Ranch kitchen, in Gallatin County, Montana Territory, in the February of 1883, that was more than enough. It was everything.